Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
Welcome to another doctrinal discussion of the New Testament. Today we will focus on Paul's emphasis on marriage and on the status of women in the church in his day. This is a most interesting and important topic, but Paul's teachings about it are often misunderstood. Our participants are Professor Camille Fronk and Professor Richard D. Draper and Professor Thomas A. Wayment. And I am Robert J. Matthews. At an earlier date, we discussed these epistles in a general way, but we will now examine precisely Paul's words about marriage and about the status of women in the church in that ancient day. This is certainly a subject upon which we must consider the context in which these things were said. The subject is also sometimes clouded by an imperfect translation into English. Sister Camille Fronk, would you begin our discussion?
Wow. The topic of Paul's teachings on women has been very interesting to me, and I've often been told things like, how could you actually enjoy teaching the Pauline epistles when Paul obviously doesn't like women very well? And my response has become, as I've studied these epistles, they have not studied Paul and the whole context of what he's saying in the epistles. More and more I see that the teachings about women and to women in these epistles are ennobling and actually further the cause that we would all hope to happen of coming to Christ. And actually reflect very much with what we see even in the Garden of Eden, with instruction that the Lord gave to Adam and Eve. I'm looking right now at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. If that's one of the ones that we wanted to look at, which is one often that comes up because of with marriage and women. Verse 9, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. The idea that he's anti-marriage, he's anti-women. And maybe we could look at that particular area first as far as Paul's teachings of marriage, and recognizing that in the Joseph Smith translation of this chapter, it opens up another kind of possibility of missionary efforts as well. We do get a different way of looking at things, don't we, with the Joseph Smith translation. But I'll tell you what I'm thinking first with chapter 7. Beginning with verses 1 and 2, there's a suggestion of a question that Paul has been given, wondering if it is good for a man not to touch a woman. This seems to be a contrast to what we got in chapter 6, where they seem to be just the opposite and very lascivious in the view of the body. Now it is the aesthetics that completely taboo of any kind of interaction at all. And
what we're doing is we're seeing at least two of the many camps within the Corinthian branch. We've got the one group who will sustain an individual who has committed a sin which is not so much as even named among the Gentiles.
Right.
And so the very libertine group. And now we're going the other way.
And he's trying to saying you're both wrong, and there's something to be valued here. And different situations that come up in chapter 7 that would suggest first 5 verses of chapter 7 that marriage is ordained of God, and there's mutual respect between husband and wife. Verse 3, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. But then verse 6, he says, I speak this by permission and not by commandment, and he gives his suggestion on a few things. 1, verses 7, 8, and 9, to the unmarried. And my understanding of that from the Greek is this is those who have once been married but are no longer married. And we don't know what the question is behind that. But I'm thinking it could be, what if I have a choice between going on a mission? I'm not married any longer now, and I have a chance to go on a mission or not. Which would be best? And he says, I suggest go without being married again. Perhaps it is, I have a possibility to marry again, but the person I will marry this time is not a member of the church. What would you suggest? I suggest not to marry at this time. We don't really know what that background is. And I think that's one of the questions that comes up a lot in these in these epistles, is trying to understand what is the question that elicited this response.
That very first verse, it is not good for a man to touch a woman, is in direct discourse. That is to say, Paul is quoting somebody. He's received a letter, and somebody has concluded it is not good for a man to touch a woman.
That's a very important point, because if you read this carelessly or hurriedly, it looks like that's Paul's statement.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, rather than something they've said to which he's responding. Yeah. Exactly right. Also, the word touch, Tom, that's hopto. I'm reaching on that one. Isn't that hoptiste here, to touch?
I think so.
That word is a Greek euphemism. Now, it means to touch, but the word is to cling to, and it is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. And so what they have concluded is there is no reason whatsoever for anyone at any time to have sexual relations with a spouse, that somehow we are beyond that. And Paul now is going to respond to that in verse 2. And the nuance in the Greek is just, it's hard to translate, because he has here a command statement. And you'll notice that the to avoid is written in italics, which means it's not in the Greek. And therefore, I would translate what that verse says as follows: because of lustfulness out there in the world, because there is this lustfulness out there in the world, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. What he seems to be saying here is not that he is opposed to marriage in any way, but rather just the opposite. Mm-hmm. It is the nature of things that women should have their own husbands and husbands should have their own wife. That is the nature of things, and that should stop the argument right there.
I often wonder in reading this too, it's hard for me to imagine that Paul is unmarried, just given the customs of the day and understanding what a Pharisee or a trained Pharisee would undergo. And I wonder if they've used, when we kind of look at this half of the conversation, that they've used Paul's unmarried or widowed status as an argument to not get married. And I think there's something to that Paul's saying, I do support marriage, but there's times when it's better to not be married, namely as missionaries, that there are appropriate times, like myself, and otherwise I would support marriage. He obviously has some positive things later in the chapter to say about marriages and how an unbelieving spouse can sanctify a believing spouse, or vice versa.
I think we have to take chapter 7 in view of verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress, I say. And therefore, what he's doing here is putting something in context. We are under distress. Because of the distress we're under, there are certain rules that are going to apply that may not apply otherwise. But certainly what he's saying in verses 1 through, I would say, 7 are the general rule, and that is that men ought to render due benevolence to their wives, that wives should render due benevolence to their husbands, and this is the natural order of things. The distress has imposed an unnatural order, but this right here is the natural order.
I'd like to just make an observation here that Paul is a realist. Now you notice verse 5. Defraud ye not one with another, except it be with consent for a time. That defraud is not the proper word there. Mm-hmm. And if you notice the footnote, in Joseph Smith's translation, it's not defraud, but depart not one from another. And Paul also, what he's really saying is, look, You'll be more true to your covenants, your marriage vows, if you're home together and not one of them gone against the other's wishes.
Yes.
I think that's a bit of realism. Paul is a very astute individual. Secondly, if you look down in verse 8, I say, therefore, to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide, even as I. Well, if you've already made up your mind that Paul is against marriage and is an unmarried man, then you can hear him saying, it'd be better if you stayed single like I am. But I think the whole tenor of this epistle and the tenor of this chapter is not marriage or unmarriage as much as it is self-discipline. And what he's saying is, I wish everybody had the discipline I have. If all of my missionaries in my mission, as though Paul is saying, had the discipline I have, we wouldn't have as many problems, we wouldn't have to make as many rules. And that, then, you see, verse 9 starts out with the word but. But because you are not as disciplined as I am, if you cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better that they marry than to not burn, particularly, but in the JST, commit sin.
Yeah.
And I've listened a great deal to people talk about Paul and say he's against marriage and one thing and another. And I've thought, of all people on the face of the earth, we as Latter-day Saints ought to be able to understand Paul. Because, as Sister Fronk alluded to, we have about 50 or 60,000 men and women out in the field as missionaries, unmarried.
Yeah.
And the counsel of the church today is, if you get married first, you probably won't go on a mission. If you go on a mission first, the chances are very great you will eventually get married. So that it's a matter of timing. Paul seems to understand that perfectly.
And I would say that we really are under much the same distress as Paul's church is under. He, of course, was looking to the apostasy. We're looking to the second coming. But because we have to get the gospel word out, therefore we do ask our young men and those young women who are so impressed to hold off marriage, to hold off schooling, and to get out there and to preach the word. I am intrigued too in verse 8 where he says, I say therefore to the unmarried and to the widows. That unmarried to me seems to be a class rather than all unmarried people. I take it to contrast with the widows. And therefore, I think his word is their agamos, which really is unmarried, but it has the implication of once married.
Yeah.
Therefore, it seems to me that he's saying, I say unto the widowers and to the widows, that for the present distress it is better that I. And therefore, I like what you suggested, Camille, and that is, right now under this distress, let's not worry about remarrying. Maybe in a few years the distress will be over. But for right now, if you're free, let's worry about getting the missionary work out there.
Yeah, he even goes as far as to say in verse 29, but I say, brother, and the time is short.
Yeah,
we just have a short little while. One of the things that always catches my attention, we wonder if Paul was married, and we kind of guess maybe he was, but I think he has some real insights into the marriage covenant, because he says in verse 5, he talks about celibacy in marriage and how that's an inappropriate thing to have. And he seems to understand, he says that when you do that, in the latter part of the verse, that you don't do that so that Satan doesn't tempt you beyond what you can bear. And I think he recognizes that natural act in marriage and says that it's not good to depart and to be celibate in marriage.
Yeah, the idea there too really is that within the marriage bounds, there are some things that are not only nice, but also proper and, may I say, necessary. And he's stressing that necessity in lieu of some Corinthians' decision that it's not good for a man to touch a woman. And he's saying, back off. You've got it exactly opposite.
But he has this perspective, too, about spreading the gospel. It's the heart of his life. He's lost. What did he say? I gave up all things for my testimony of Christ. And one wonders just what he lost, what he gave up, if family was part of that. but he will wear out his life in spreading the gospel, and he sees people for just a short time go out, serve your missions, and the opportunities that will not only give to people in hearing the gospel, but how it can later bless family when you do have your own family.
You know, verse 32 would probably tap into that idea. It says, he says about halfway down, he that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord. And that seems to be his overarching concern, that when you're unmarried as a missionary, you care more for the things of the Lord than for a family back at home. And maybe that does fit his missionary concern.
I think that's the way in which we have to read this, is in a missionary context. And evidently the church has seen that that's the best way, and that is we send out young men and young women unmarried. And then when they're older, they can go as couples. But as young men and young women, they'll do more missionary work if they go out single.
Yeah, very, very good point.
I know that that's a proven fact, and so as you're reading those verses, we need to interpret those in terms of a missionary context. Let's turn then to 1 Timothy chapter 2. There are some rather interesting statements there. I like to read the chapter headings. You know, these headings were written by Elder McConkie, and they really are the commentary in this LDS edition of the Bible. And so to chapter 2, the heading, we should pray for all men. Christ is our mediator. Women should dress modestly. Women blessed in childbearing. Admonished to continue in faith, charity, and holiness. I think first and foremost that what we understand about Paul is an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, and his main thrust is to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. He is a representative, an ambassador for Jesus Christ. So what he says in terms of behavior always has to be seen in the context of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And I think if we start with that perspective and know then what he's saying, there's truth there, that we look for the angle that would help us to understand how it links with everything else that the Lord has taught, rather than finding fault with that. They're much easier to find answers.
Yes,
in addition to that, we have to remember that the context is we have a lot of Gentiles flowing into the church. And they bring with them certain preconceived ideas, some of which are not compatible. Now, many will be compatible, but there's certain ways of dress, certain ways of behavior that are not compatible. And it's true of the Jewish members of the church that Christianity is its own thing, and therefore we have to see Paul addressing specific problems, either introduced into the church by the Gentiles or introduced into the church by the Jewish members. Seems to be what's going on all the way through here.
We also probably have a young leader in Timothy who needs help in a new branch, in a new area where he may be faced with some problems we're not fully aware of, but Paul seems to be instructing him, Timothy, this is how you'll need to govern and how you'll need to be a bishop in this ward of mixed Gentiles and Jewish converts, which may be a struggle.
Yeah, I would say the background is, as I study this and say, okay, now what is going on that would cause Paul to address with so much passion. And this is a passionate epistle. I mean, he is very straightforward. But as I take a look at chapter 5 over here with verse 13, speaking of widowers and young women within the church, these aren't children, but those who should be about the Lord's business, he says, and withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house. And not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. So apparently there's a lot of gossip going on. Apparently there's a lot of people trying to shove in their oar, take over where they don't belong. And Paul is sensitive to this as he writes the epistle.
So come back to chapter 2 with that. Looking at verse 8, I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting, which makes you wonder what kind of demeanor there might have been even associated with prayer generally in the church. And then in like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair, that is, or gold or pearls or costly array, but becometh women professing godliness with good works. Let the women learn in silence with all subjection. I think one in there seems to be perhaps some of these busybody, tattling women that also could dress inappropriately. I think there's something that underscores there's something about a demeanor in the way we dress and in the way we behave that makes a difference of whether we invite greater worship or whether we offend the Spirit. My favorite definition of modesty is behavior as well as appearance that does not bring undue attention to oneself. That would be distracting. Yeah. And I think even though their particular modesty issues would be different from ours today, the principle is the same as far as how we present ourselves and demeanor as well as appearance that would encourage that. And that leads to that verse 11, let the women learn in silence. That word silence, hesuchia, is that? Is the Greek, which means more tranquil or calm.
Calmness, yeah.
It's the idea, I should do this. Calm down. And
Take a breath.
not maybe some confrontations that the women could have been.
Rather than to be beaten down.
Right.
She is of her own free will, peaceful and contented.
Yes. But notice the other piece of that women learn. I think that's a part of this. It's the same way back in 1 Corinthians when we talk about women praying with their heads covered. We get all upset sometimes that they have to have their heads covered. I think it's quite fascinating that we see in 1 Corinthians 11, they prayed.
Oh, and prophesy.
And prophesy.
And they have a right to do so.
And they are learning. Think what's going on in the Jewish society and then even Greek society as far as women and learning. Wouldn't Aristotle say something like that women have inferior minds and cannot reason? And in Jewish society, women were not even allowed to study the Holy Writ. Here, Paul is saying, women learn, but let's do it calmly. Let's do it in a way that invites the Spirit, that is not distracting.
Let's take the word subjection there also. Probably a better translation would have been cooperation.
And it is better.
Paul could have said there, sige, in the sense of complete silence and listening. But in there, like you mentioned, it's really calmness in order, I think. And we get some sense of that in verse 8, where he talks about the men praying without wrath. And that's an odd image that he's counseling, that maybe there is some inappropriate dress in prayer and inappropriate methods of prayer. And he's saying, let's do this in order, both men and women here, that he has counsel for both.
And he really does say in verse 8 again, just to be fair, the word doubting actually in the Greek means to dispute. They're coming together and they're wrangling over methodology.
Quarreling.
And he says this. Quarreling. Yeah,
men and women are doing it.
Yes, men and women.
I think we
so
can
he's
see
saying
both
everybody's
of them
got to come together.
But maybe they do it differently. Women do this wrangling differently than men, and it's creating different kinds of problems.
Let's look at verse 12 for a moment. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. Again, I think we need to have a little idea of the context and a little idea of the proper translation. I would interpret that he's not talking about a woman usurping authority over men in general, but maybe this is a priesthood issue. And that what he's saying is women should not organize churches or conduct the business of churches. They should not take the role of the priesthood. That's the way I would put that in a context.
And again, I like Camille's reference to 1 Corinthians 11, where...
Yeah, would you comment on that, please?
Well, Paul says that we've got the veil issue, but besides the veil issue, he says that women are to pray and to prophesy. And we misunderstand that word prophesy to mean prognostication. It really is the bearing of testimony. The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus.
Professing the truth.
Exactly right. That's what, and they are allowed to do this. They are encouraged to do this in church. But I fear that some have run ahead. They've got this much of an opening, and therefore they're running ahead.
Which is 1 Corinthians 14 with the Joseph Smith translation, that women are not to rule in the
not
church.
to rule in the church.
Can I just do one quick quote?
If you do it quickly.
This is quick. President Packer saying there's a difference between the way that the church, the priesthood functions in the home as compared to the church. And I think that's part of what the problem is here, of understanding. In the church, there's a distinct line of authority. We serve, we're called by those who preside over us. In the home, it's a partnership with husband and wife equally yoked together, sharing in decisions, always working together. Line of authority in the church, partnership in the home. And I think that makes a difference as far as ruling in the church, what women are required to do and what he's cautioning them about here versus having a voice in the church.
I just make one closing observation. The practice of the church today, being led by prophets and apostles with equal authority to that which Paul had, so that the practice and interpretation of the church today is the proper interpretation of what Paul meant. Mm-hmm. We're working through an imperfect translation and an imperfect recording, and therefore the interpretation is given by living apostles and prophets in our day. Well, we didn't get to Titus chapter 2, but anybody can read that on their own, and they would find a little bit of enrichment from that which we did. Thank you for your comments.
For expanded information on the content of this episode of The Acts to Revelation, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.